The Ex-Worker.
An audio strike against a monotone world.
A twice-monthly, more or less, podcast of anarchist ideas and action.
For everyone who dreams of a life off the clock.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back at long last to The Ex-Worker.
First off, we want to apologize for the extended break from putting out episodes. It's a long story, but suffice to say, it's been a difficult time in the lives of many of your Clara and Alanises.
We have interviews completed and edited on a variety of different themes, and plenty of different episodes in the works. So rest assured that for at least the foreseeable future, there will be more episodes rolling out. So thanks for your patience as we work some things out. We hope to be back on track soon.
In this episode, we'll be focusing on the social revolution unfolding in the predominantly Kurdish autonomous territories of Rojava, where on the borderlands of Turkey, Syria, and Iraq, a coalition of self-organized militias stunned the world by defeating the Islamic State in the war-torn city of Kobane.
We'll hear from a variety of different supporters of the revolution in Rojava, and on the chopping block, we'll review a new English-language book that collects texts about the struggle. Plus, we've got tons of listener feedback, some news and upcoming events, and plenty more. I'm Alanis.
And I'm Clara, and we'll be your hosts. For links, references, and more info about all the topics we cover on the show, visit our website at crimethink.com/podcast.
And please get in touch with us via email with your comments, questions, and suggestions to podcast@crimethink.com.
Here we go.
We'll kick things off with the Hot Wire, news of revolt, rebellion, repression, and resistance around the world. Obviously, a lot has been happening out there since our last episode, and we couldn't hope to encapsulate it all. We'll get back to a more thorough roundup of recent news events in our upcoming episodes. But for now, here are a few recent happenings of particular relevance to anarchists that we wanted to highlight. After the funeral of Freddie Gray, a young black man killed by police, the city of Baltimore erupted in its most intense riots in decades, with residents taking the streets in droves, burning cars and buildings, fighting racist baseball fans, liberating police horses, and injuring 20 police officers. Over 200 arrests were made, schools were closed, a week-long curfew was imposed, and the governor of Maryland promised to occupy the city with some 2,000 troops. Solidarity demonstrations have spread across the country and beyond. The 6 cops involved in Gray's death are facing criminal charges, but rage continues to simmer. The 5E3, or Carlos, Amelie, and Fallon, anarchists imprisoned in Mexico on charges of an incendiary attack against government and corporate targets, have been released. Congratulations to all 3 of them, and welcome home. Anarchist Emma Shepherd was sentenced to 2 years in prison in Bristol, UK, for damaging the tires on some police cars. It's a pretty extreme punishment, but it comes in the context of the embarrassment and anti-anarchist resentment of Bristol authorities after dozens of militant actions in recent years against a wide range of state and capitalist targets that have largely gone unpunished. On the first weekend in April, anarchists in Ljubljana, Slovenia hosted an anarchist radio gathering, which brought together participants in several different radio projects across Europe to share skills and coordinate their efforts. You can listen to a joint production made during the gathering on the website of Černá Lupňa, the Slovenian anarchist radio show. We've got the link posted on our website. The anarchist publishing company AK Press suffered a serious fire at their warehouse, which killed 2 people in the neighboring building and destroyed a devastating amount of their merchandise. They're raising money to get back on their feet. If you want to show them some support, you can visit gofundme.com/akpressfire. Quite a lot of the books we've reviewed on the chopping block, as well as dozens and dozens more that have shaped our anarchist ideas, have come from AK Press. They're a working model of an economic collective run on anarchist principles, and their space has hosted countless readings and talks and events. We love y'all and send our support and sympathy. Anarchists in Bogota, Colombia, staged a militant march to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the murder of 15-year-old anarchist Nicolás Niera by police at a demonstration. We received this statement from the anarchist Black Cross in the Czech Republic about anti-anarchist repression just prior to May Day. Here's the report. On Tuesday, April 28th, police of the Czech Republic started a wave of repression against so-called suspects of crime connected to ultra-left extremism. 13 people have been arrested so far. The police won't give any more information because their action is still ongoing across the country. At Ateneo, a cultural and social center in the city of Most, a group of unwelcome guests came all the way from Prague, the criminal police from the Unit for Detection of Organized Crime. They wore balaclavas and had dogs as well. Several police raids took place at a number of different locations. Some people were released after just a few hours, while the rest have been kept in detention and interrogated. One major server was confiscated by police, so a majority of Czech anarchist web pages have been down. Since receiving this message, we've seen updates that after another round of arrests, some comrades are facing terrorism charges, accused of planning an attack on a train transporting Hyundai cars as part of the conspiracy cells of fire. They've been under state surveillance since last fall. Subsequently, a massive police raid evicted the only squat in Prague, with 12 arrests and at least 4 injuries. We'll try to keep you posted on developments and how we can show solidarity. And, of course, there was our favorite holiday of the year, May Day. Since 1886, anarchists have been turning out to protest, march, riot, and rabble-rouse on the 1st of May, and 2015 was no exception. In case you haven't heard it, our very first episode included a historical account of the origins of May Day and the Haymarket Affair. So take a few minutes to check out that if you're interested. We'll now continue our annual tradition of a yearly report back on the day's events with our May Day correspondent, Bill Tane. Bill, give us a roundup of this year's events.
Thanks, Alanis. This year, most May Day demonstrations addressed anti-austerity themes, as states around the world attempt to squeeze their populations with unprecedented cruelty as capitalist crisis escalates. However, here in the U.S., many marches and demonstrations focused on racist police violence, as we might expect, given the murderous but rebellious last year. Solidarity with the anti-police rebellion in Baltimore was expressed across the country. Some highlights include Oakland, where hundreds of longshore workers struck and joined protests, and rebels broke into a car dealership and smashed dozens of new cars. In Seattle, where rebels clashed with police, injuring several and attacking cars. In Minneapolis, where high school students walked out of class to join a Black Lives Matter protest. We got one email from a listener in New York City who participated in a shut-down NYPD action. Labor activists also briefly occupied the Guggenheim Museum. In Canada, spiky marches and decentralized actions took place in Montreal, where the anti-capitalist Convergence and many other groups had called for strikes and demos. Anti-capitalist events also took place in Vancouver, Toronto, and elsewhere. Looking south, hundreds clashed with police at a large march in Bogota, Colombia, whose themes included solidarity with a massive teachers' strike. Teachers also led a march in Oaxaca, Mexico, during which anarchists set fire to the offices of the PRI, Mexico's ruling political party. Thousands of Costa Rican workers participated in an annual march in San Jose, including a group of masked anarchists with a banner reading, "A docile public makes for good slaves." In Santiago, Chile, 2 separate marches stepped off from Plaza Los Héroes. The CUT, Chile's largest trade union, led a peaceful march to the right, geographically speaking, while another march, under the slogan "For a Combative and Classist May Day," headed, well, left. The second march left a trail of graffiti, trashed churches, and fires in its wake. It ended with a revolutionary cumbia band playing from the stage, while masked encapuchados fought riot police and water cannons. At least one encapuchado was seen holding a sign in solidarity with the revolt in Baltimore. As usual, socialist-friendly governments staged massive official rallies. Venezuelan President Maduro flew to Havana, Cuba, to attend their rally before flying back to Caracas to attend the one in his own country. Across the Atlantic, punks snarled traffic and drunkenly tangled with cops at Class War's acid techno-fueled, fuck parade in London. While in Middlesbrough, members of the Teesside Anarchist Network occupied the Unemployed Workers Center, demanding it be, quote, brought back to life in the aftermath of the bankers' crisis and austerity. Chuckles were had across the Channel when rebels in Nantes, France, gave the courthouse a dramatic new red paint job. Anti-fascist and anarchist demos took place across Germany, including a number of smaller towns. Hundreds marched in Wuppertal, Dortmund, Weimar, and of course Berlin, though police labeled the notorious Walpurgisnacht demos there calmer than usual. One of the larger convergences in Europe took place in Milan, Italy, as part of the No Expo 2015 convergence. In defiance of a massive corporate death spectacle called Expo 2015, basically a World's Fair on steroids, several days of assemblies, celebrations, and anti-capitalist and anti-fascist protests took place. And on May Day, black blocs smashed banks and burned police cars. One militant was quoted as saying, "Our generation does not want this corporate bullshit." Barcelona saw militant protests despite the recent success of the pacifying left-wing Podemos party, with numerous banks and businesses attacked. Likewise, in Athens, Greece, while respectable unions attended a respectable demonstration that included plenty of the newly elected left party Syriza's representatives, anarchists did their thing, lighting dumpsters on fire and chucking Molotovs and so forth. In Istanbul, demonstrators clashed with a mass of 20,000 police determined to prevent them from reaching Taksim Square, with flaming barricades and running street battles across the city. In Moscow and St. Petersburg, Russian nationalism dovetailed with Soviet nostalgia to thoroughly appropriate the large May Day rallies, with so-called communists calling for support to separatist rebels in eastern Ukraine. One of the most massive demonstrations took place in Seoul, South Korea, where some 100,000 protesters converged, outraged at government austerity measures and the cover-up of a ferry disaster, which we discussed briefly in episode 24. Militant trade unionists attacked police buses that attempted to pen in the demonstrations. Protesters also threw colored smoke grenades in Taipei, Taiwan, burned a massive effigy of the president in Manila, Philippines, protested militarism and nuclear power in Tokyo, Japan, gathered garment workers in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, and came together in Baghdad, Dhaka, Jakarta, and beyond. Anarchists in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, rocked the capital city with graffiti that read, "Fuck capitalism," and stormed various symbols of capitalist wealth, like a McDonald's. The pictures are pretty cool. Look them up. In Melbourne and Sydney, Australia, demonstrators shut down city centres in solidarity with rural Aboriginal people facing closure of their communities. Similar demos took place in over 100 cities across the country. If you'd like to see a May Day report back, with great visuals and their typically irreverent sense of humor, don't miss the Stimulator's latest episode, available at submedia.tv. Until next year, this is Bill Tame. Back to you, Claire and Alanis.
And now we're going to take on some listener feedback. And good grief, do we have a lot of it. Again, we apologize to everyone for such a long delay. It's going to take us a while to get caught up with all of the correspondence, both via email and here in the episodes, but we'll do our best to get to everything we can.
First off, I just want to sincerely thank everyone who wrote in to say that they missed the show, asking when the next episode would be and offering encouragement to us. That really meant the world to us and helped us get through the difficult times and back on track with the podcast. Even if we didn't reply directly to you, thanks a million for helping us keep up our morale to keep making the X-Worker happen.
That said, we've got a number of odds and ends to cover. Where do we start?
First of all, back in episode 33, we left out the links to the Accomplices Not Allies essay, as well as the 2015 Convergence Against Colonialism and Genocide in St. Augustine, Florida. We've got both of these posted now in our show notes for this episode, in case you haven't gotten to see them.
Just as a reminder, the essay Accomplices Not Allies, Abolishing the Ally-Industrial Complex offers critical suggestions for non-Indigenous radicals around how to connect to Indigenous liberation struggles outside of the increasingly suspect identity politics discourse of the Ally. While the St. Augustine Convergence, which is taking place September 5th through 9th, opposes the city's celebrations commemorating the anniversary of Spanish conquest and colonization in Florida.
Next, listener Monk got in touch to ask about perspectives on anarchist parenting. Monk writes,
Hello, ex-worker. First, let me say that I thoroughly enjoy your podcast. It has done a lot towards making me rethink my positions, challenge my own privilege, and inspire me to act instead of sitting idle. However, something that I have not heard a lot about in anarchist media is topics around raising an anarchist family. I have 2 young daughters who are just getting to school age, and I find that I am unsure how to teach them anarchist philosophies and ideas. I encourage them to think for themselves, question everything, and I have tons of anarchist books for them to read when they get a little bit older. However, they are still very young, so I struggle with exposing them to too much too soon. They already have subconsciously picked up on my aversion to cops, and my 6-year-old already tries to hide her face from CCTV cameras when she is thinking about it. Maybe a segment on what anarchist parents are doing with their kids? I live in an area with little to no active anarchist communities and have found few other anarchists, let alone anarchist parents. Just some food for thought.
Thanks for the suggestion, Monk. Although neither of us are parents, we definitely value the anarchists among us who are raising kids. We could do some reading and pull some things together, but really it might be best to just put out the word to our listeners and see who wants to share their experiences.
So, are any of y'all out there helping to co-parent or raise kids? Or are you a kid of radical parents with something to say? Write us at podcast@crimethink.com and let us know. If you'd like to contribute your thoughts on anti-authoritarian parenting, or share a story about how you've dealt with particular challenges, drop us a line and we'll share them on a future show.
In the meantime, we've got a few links posted on our website that share some perspectives on raising children to disrespect authority.
Well, what's next, Alanis?
Listener Peter C. wrote in to say, Hello, I have a proposal for you. It has to with investing in your company. Kindly get back to me with a reconfirmation of your company name, area of specialization, address, and your position in the company. Upon your response, I shall forward you comprehensive details. Best regard, Peter C. Well, Peter, I think that...
Alanis?
Yeah? What?
I'm pretty sure that was spam.
Oh. Huh. Yeah, I guess you're right.
Sorry.
Clara, do you think all of our listener feedback emails are spam?
Oh no, don't worry. Some of them are trolls.
Ouch.
JK, I'm almost positive that we have actual real-live listeners, in addition to the internet-based life forms.
But even the spam bots are being impacted by revolutionary struggles. One of the most weirdly poignant spam emails I've gotten in recent years was that one that supposedly came from Suzanne Mubarak.
Wait, the wife of the deposed Egyptian dictator?
Exactly. Read this.
Dear Sir, Madam, I am Mrs. Suzanne, the wife of the former Egyptian leader, who is currently in prison with my 2 sons, Allah and Gamal, resulting from political turmoil during the 2011 uprising, which was fabricated without evidence. All our traveling documents and money has been seized to prevent us from traveling out of the country. As a result of this uncertainty, I need somebody outside my country to represent my interest, Manage our reserved funds, value $50 million in long-term business venture, especially in private real estate or mega hotel in your country, in the name of my son, but it shall be under your custody. I am willing to negotiate management sharing percentage with you after your acceptance, yada yada. Yours faithfully, Mrs. Suzanne Hosni Mubarak.
Can you believe my luck? Thanks to the rebels of the Arab Spring, I'm getting rich. Time to invest in some real estate and mega hotels.
How bizarre.
I'm fantasizing about a world in which our inboxes get so swamped with spam emails from Michelle Obama and Mrs. Putin and so forth, pleading with us to send our bank account numbers since they've all been deposed, that we all just stop checking our email and hang out at the General Assembly all day.
Whatever floats your boat, Alanis.
Speaking of revolution and the internet, listener John wrote in to ask why we weren't talking about Ross Ulbricht.
Ross who?
Ross Ulbricht. That's the guy who was accused of running the infamous Silk Road website, the internet black market where you could buy literally anything, drugs, guns, whatever, without regard to state regulations or taxes, with the help of digital anonymity tools like Tor and so-called cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. In February, Ulbricht was convicted of drug trafficking, money laundering, and 5 other offenses, and will be sentenced next month. He faces between 20 years and life in prison.
So why does John want us to be talking about him?
Well, I don't know for sure, but I do know that when we start talking about efforts to use the internet and cryptocurrencies to conduct economic exchange outside of state control, we're veering into some very interesting and controversial territory for anarchists. We touched on it to a limited extent in episode 18 on anarcho-capitalism and libertarianism. If you recall our discussion there, it's no surprise that folks who see market forces as the basis for social relations and simply want the state out of the way will see cases like this as crucially important. It'll be interesting to see whether he gets framed as a political prisoner.
Ross Ulbricht, the Mumia Abu Jamal of the ANCAPs.
Seriously, though, every movement needs its martyrs, and it's very possible that all the media attention around this case could lead folks interested in cryptocurrencies and online anti-state economics to get engaged in challenging state repression. I guess the best case scenario would be if large numbers of people who were interested in Silk Road or Bitcoin or whatever started making connections between Ulbricht's case and other forms of state repression and connected with other radicals. We can already see this to a certain extent in the overlap between folks who are critical of the drug war and thus mass incarceration, who followed Ulbricht's case because of that angle, and folks from a libertarian or market anarchist persuasion.
In any case, there doesn't seem to have been a whole lot of visible interest on the part of anarchists in the case, despite the mainstream media attention given to it. We don't have time to go into depth in this episode, but it would be interesting to have a more extensive discussion in a future episode of the potentials and limitations of things like Silk Road and cryptocurrencies from an anarchist perspective.
The rationale articulated behind Silk Road sounds like it has some elements of interest to anarchists. On an online profile, Ulbricht had written, "I want to use economic theory as a means to abolish the use of coercion and aggression amongst mankind. The most widespread and systemic use of force is amongst institutions and governments. So this is my current point of effort. The best way to change a government is to change the minds of the governed, however. To that end, I am creating an economic simulation to give people a first-hand experience of what it would be like to live in a world without the systemic use of force."
So he sees the free exchange of goods outside of the mechanisms of state coercion as a pathway towards freedom from domination.
Yeah, sounds like it. That's about as close to an activist articulation of anarcho-capitalist ideals as I've ever encountered.
Still, though, where my affinity with these ideas gets stuck is on the notion of individualism.
What do you mean?
This framework seems to understand society as nothing more than a collection of isolated, sovereign, rational individuals establishing contractual relations with one another with greater or lesser freedom, depending on the coercive control exerted by outside institutions like states. I certainly want to live in a world without the systemic use of force. But in the world we actually live in, individuals are bound up in a matrix of numerous overlapping relations of hierarchy and are also profoundly interdependent, like we discussed in episode 33 on Ferguson and the roots of white supremacy. Police murders of young black men are merely the most spectacular tip of the iceberg of how white supremacy structures life in the U.S. To think that white supremacy would end if only the state and its agents would stop enforcing it fails to recognize all the ways that it is coded into the economy, patterns of migration and settlement, language, and so many other facets of life. Liberation has to be more than subtraction of external constraint. It has to include extending our individual and collective capacities to flourish and realize our potential. Anarchism, as the rejection of all forms of hierarchy and domination, could be capable of waging a struggle that thoroughly transforms our lives. If we truly want to live in a world free of coercion, aggression, and the systemic use of force, that's what it would take, far more than simply removing state control over economic exchange.
That's not to say that people like Ulbricht who are taking steps in that direction aren't doing something interesting. But we shouldn't mistake online crypto exchange for anarchism in action. These so-called individual economic decisions have entire sets of social relations built into them, and can reflect or reinforce coercion and domination even without a state behind the wheel. If you could buy, for example, depleted uranium on an unregulated online market outside of state control, rather than having to navigate taxes and institutional regulations, that doesn't necessarily mean we'd be living in a better world. If market forces dictate that someone wants to spend their Bitcoin on it, we'd still all have to deal with the consequences from the pollution and potential cataclysmic destruction and so forth. This myopic idea that an invisible hand will somehow guide free economic activity such that it magically ends up being to the benefit of all is just flat out wrong. And that wrongness is one of the reasons why people put their faith in state coercion as one of the only barriers against the potentially disastrous consequences of quote-unquote freedom in the economic sphere alongside various forms of hierarchy and domination in other spheres. The challenge for anarchists is to always remain firm in our anti-capitalist and anti-state convictions in both directions.
Meaning, on the one hand, challenging the libertarians to recognize how market forces themselves incarnate hierarchies that must be dismantled, while on the other hand, reminding liberals that only autonomous self-organization and not state coercion can protect us from the suffering engendered by the capitalist market.
Exactly. Think about the anarcho-capitalist market utopias imagined by Bitcoiners and Silk Roaders versus the economic experiments going on in Rojava, which we'll touch on later. Neither one may be the ideal encapsulation of all our anarchist principles.
As formulated here in our armchairs.
Sure. But compare and contrast the social relations that are coded into these divergent notions of economy and society. It makes sense that in a fiercely individualistic and consumerist society like the U.S., the notions of freedom like those of Ross Ulbricht or proponents of libertarian cryptocurrencies would seem appealing to many. Whereas in a tightly knit village-based society that has undergone incredibly violent repression and material insecurity, as in Rojava, it makes sense that more collectivist and interdependent notions would come to the forefront. Let's pay attention to all of these and keep reflecting on them in the light of our anarchist and anti-capitalist convictions.
And finally, one listener asked if we were planning to do an episode on the Islamic State, or ISIS. Well, in a word, no. If you want to know what we think about the Islamic State, we can sum it up pretty quickly. We're against them. But this episode will be focusing on one of the dimensions of the conflicts in Iraq, Syria, and Turkey that is of great interest to anarchists: the revolutionary fervor in Rojava, which included the military defeat of ISIS forces by a coalition of Kurdish nationalists, anarchists, refugees, and independent locals and self-organized militias.
Shall we get started?
Let's.
You're listening to
The X
Worker.
an audio strike
against a monotone world.
So, where is Rojava? What has been happening there in the last few years? And why is this of interest to anarchists? Okay, let's set the scene. It's 2011, and the revolutions of the Arab Spring have swept from Tunisia into Egypt and are spreading across the world. In Syria, a brutal civil war breaks out, which continues to this day. As the embattled Assad regime focused on fighting against a variety of insurgents, from Islamic fundamentalists to the US-backed coalition known as the Free Syria Army, people of the Kurdish region of northern Syria asserted their autonomy and began carrying out experiments in horizontal organization. They organized their autonomous provinces, called cantons, under the name of Rojava, which in Kurdish means both west, as it is the western part of Kurdistan, as well as sunset. Rojava is surrounded on all sides by hostile forces. Assad's beleaguered Syrian government, which lost control of the region a couple of years ago, the Turkish government, known for oppressing its Kurdish minority, the Syrian opposition forces, including the Free Syrian Army and other groups, the Kurdish regional government in Iraq, a longtime rival of Syrian Kurdish organizations, and, most pressingly, the Islamic State, also known as ISIS, an unrecognized state entity that gained control of much of Iraq and Syria between 2013 and 14, using captured weapons brought into the region during the U.S. military occupation. In September 2014, ISIS pressed north towards Kobane, hoping to secure control of the entire border with Turkey. Hundreds of thousands crossed the border into Turkey as refugees, fleeing before the advance of the, as of then, undefeated and notoriously brutal fighters of the Islamic State. But a small handful of Kurdish militants remained in the city, determined to fight for it to the death. For over 4 months, they waged a street-by-street battle for Kobane. For much of that time, they were pinned down in the center of the ruined city, with ISIS on 3 sides and the hostile Turkish government holding the border behind them. Yet, in the end, these ill-equipped autonomous fighters from Rojava halted the seemingly unstoppable advance of the Islamic State across the Middle East, driving ISIS out of Kobane in late January. Suddenly, the world began to pay attention to Rojava, and the mass media's curious gaze briefly focused on this spectacle of self-organized informal militias, some entirely staffed by women, who had succeeded in defeating ISIS, who so many state forces had failed to stop or declined to risk to try. And it turns out that the militias formed only one part of a broad, ongoing social revolution that has been unfolding for years. In summer 2013, CrimethInc interviewed the Turkish group Revolutionary Anarchist Action, known as DAF by the Turkish acronym, about the uprising that began in Gezi Park, covered in the last issue of Rolling Thunder. At the end of summer 2014, we learned that DAF was supporting the fierce resistance of the residents of the town of Kobane against the Islamic State. We'll introduce our coverage about the Rojava Revolution with excerpts from 2 interviews with members of DAF active in the resistance in Kobane. The first originally appeared in January 2015 on the Slovenian anarchist radio show Černa Luknja and discusses some of the major forces involved in Kobane, DAF's role in solidarity with the Rojava Revolution, and its significance for revolutionaries around the world. The second took place in correspondence between CrimethInc and DAF between October and December 2014, and elaborates on the geopolitical context in more depth. You can read the full interviews on the CrimethInc blog through the link on our website, and a revised edition will appear in the forthcoming issue of Rolling Thunder magazine. A quick note before we begin. There are a lot of groups with a lot of acronyms in this story, and we'll do our best to keep you oriented. In this first interview, you'll hear reference to the PKK, or PKK. That's the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the international militant Kurdish organization. Historically, the PKK was more of a traditional Marxist-Leninist national liberation guerrilla group, but more recently, under the influence of their leader Abdullah Öcalan, the group is reported to have taken a more anti-authoritarian turn. The PYD, or PYD, refers to the Kurdish Party of Democratic Unity, a Syrian political party affiliated with the PKK. The YPJ and YPG refer to the People's Protective Units and the Women's Protective Units, respectively. These are the militias founded by the PYD that have been active since 2012. The YPG includes some 45 to 50,000 fighters, male and female, while the all-female YPJ includes an additional 10,000 fighters. So now, let's begin our coverage of the revolution in Rojava with Černa Luknja's interview with the Turkish group Revolutionary Anarchist Action, or DAF.
So we are talking with a comrade from DAF, Anarchist Organization. So we can start with the interview. Can you, for the beginning, give us a little bit of overview of the situation in Turkey, Iraq, border regions, and presentation of involved groups and militias there?
Hello, greetings from Istanbul to all comrades. I'll start with the people living in the regions. They are mostly Kurdish, who are there for hundreds of years, and the region had never a state, and because of that, the people of this region has been in struggle for a very long time. The people has a very diverse ethnicity and diverse religions like Kurdish and Arabic and Syrians and Yazidis, the people, and the organizations, the people's organizations first. In Turkey and Iraq, part is PKK, it's a people's freedom organization, the struggle for freedom, and PYD in Syria, it's on the same in the same line, and their militia is YPG and YPJ, which is men militia and women militia. These are the people's organizations there, and against these, the first is the ISIS, which is the Islamic gangs, and Al-Nusra is involved in the attacks. These are the radical Islam, and also there is a Free Syrian Army, which is many groups joined together. They are supported by the capitalist system, but they are not as radical as ISIS. And there is the states like Assad state and the Turkish state who are on the attack. There is also on the north Iraq a capital state of the Kurdish, which is KPD, Barzani's state, which is ideologically the same as Turkish state, but its ethnicity is different.
So, if I understand you correct, in Syria you have this Kurdish Party of Democratic Unity, which is supposed to be progressive and is connected with the Kurdish Workers' Party from the Turkey. And then on the other side, you have Turkish government and Kurdish regional government in Iraq. And of course, Islamic State and
Nusra and other gangs, radical.
Okay.
The PKK is not very, has a bad reputation in the West because of its past. Like in 20 years ago when it was founded, it was a Marxist-Leninist group, but after maybe 5-10 years, it has changed and completely denounced its origins of Marxist-Leninist because of the ideas of the leader, and has changed, and all of the people had moved towards a more libertarian ideology. Because of the readings of Öcalan, of Bookchin, and also other factors in the region. So, in practice, we can say that in the beginning, like PKK was not an ideological. It didn't grow as an ideological movement. It was a people's movement. So this is another factor why it became this way.
Okay, so. Can you in your texts and in your informations that you are sending around and writing, you are speaking about Rojava revolution in the region, obviously, and can you explain what do you mean with this Rojava revolution? What kind of social experiment is it, and why it is important for anti-authoritarian social movements around the world?
Okay. Rojava Revolution was declared 2 years ago with 3 cantons declared their independence towards the states. The state of the Syria, Assad regime, and also they didn't want involvement with the internationally supported capitalist powers. So it was maybe a third front in the region, and it was successful where there was an environment where the states around the region was lost power, and it began as a project of the Kurdish struggle, and it involved directly democratic practices like people's assemblies, and also it focused on ethnic diversity and power to the people, as well as women's liberation, which is, it's not just in Rojava, it's a general focus of the Kurdish movement. This is about the women's liberation. And they formed their own defense units, which is a voluntary organization just made of the people living there.
Okay. So you are part of Revolutionary Anarchist Action, anarchist group DAF from Turkey. And one of the focuses of your activities in last months or years is also building solidarity and mutual aid with the people in Kurdistan. So can you maybe just give a short introduction into your group? What kind of group is DAF? And can you explain what is your involvement in the Rojava revolution and Kobane resistance and so on?
DAF advocates a revolutionary perspective. We call ourselves revolutionary anarchists because we want anarchism to be socialized in our region. Because in this region, anarchy doesn't have a tradition or a history. And our first aim is to socialize the idea of anarchism, and also the practice is more important for us than the theory. We build our theory on the practice, which is we call the revolutionary anarchists. We are against all forms of oppression. We focus on workers' movements and people's movements, which are oppressed because of ethnicity, and also women's oppression. We have actions in all of them. And involvement for Rojava, we were reading and contacting the Rojava revolution since it started. And when the Kobane resistance started, we immediately went to the region. Our comrades organized solidarity actions in both sides of the border, and still we have some comrades there. And we are still organizing actions like recently, a subgroup of the anarchist women went there for a meeting, and also they called for conscientious objection in support of the Kobane resistance.
You're listening to an interview that took place in January 2015 between the Slovenian anarchist radio show Črna Luknja and a Turkish anarchist involved in solidarity with the struggles of the people of Rojava. If you'd like to learn more about the DAF anarchist organization in Turkey, check out the interview conducted with participants in the 2013 Gezi Park uprising, which appeared on the CrimethInc blog in 2013. We've got the link posted on our website. Now, back to the interview.
DAF, anarchist organization, is very involved directly on the Turkey-Syrian border. You are involved, if I understand right, in human change, human chain.
Yes.
There we're supposed to protect Kurdish from Islamic State fighters to pass the border on Turkish side and then back again to Syria and so on. So what's the situation there? This is some direct action you are involved very much, if I understand correctly.
Yes, currently and from the beginning, the Turkish state has been attacking actively, like to the west, and politically the Turkish state sounds they are against ISIS. But in practice, you can see that both it has material and arms and people passing through the border to help IS, and also it is attacking the villages on the border, because the border villages are not very separate from Kobane, because it's the same families, and there is a lot of people from Kobane who pass when they are injured, or when other people want to join, they pass through the border. Our comrades are staying in the villages and participate all the actions in the communes, in the villages, doing logistic support for the refugees and injured people.
So I would ask you, what about mainstream media? They said Kobane will fall, despite the fact that resistance on the ground never gave up. Why do you think they reported in this way, and what is the coverage now?
So this was a psychological war in the beginning, and the media didn't want the Kobane resistance to be heard, and this is part of the psychological war, because there was a lot of international support. This was to cut it, and also after, just before it was evident that Kobane wouldn't fall, and they changed tactics, and all international powers looked like they were helping, like the airstrikes and like the Kurdish state sending a few fighters right before it was evident that Kobane wouldn't fall, to look like they are not against this.
Yeah, it is very obvious that the Rojava revolution, or the social experiment that is going on there, people's struggle for freedom, is not in the interest of the big world powers. So this is nothing surprisingly. So maybe for the end we would ask you, what do you think are the perspectives for the Rojava revolution, for Kobane resistance? What is the situation on the ground now, and what can we expect? And also, of course, how can people from other countries support the resistance and the revolution there?
Lately, the other cantons of Rojava had been attacked, and like the Afrin had some threats, and also in the Cizre canton, if you remember, months ago, when the ISIS first attacked, many people, or Yazidi people, had to leave their cities, and they were saved by the PYD fighters, the PYD fighters. And ISIS was repelled, and last week the Yazidi people in Shanghai have formed their own defense units, which are called now BYD and PYJ, similar to the PYD. So this is a sign that the struggle is growing in the region, where the self-defense and direct democracy idea is gaining more support, and it's growing. Also, on the Turkish side, the war is getting harsher, and the Turkish government is using more violence against the Kurdish resistance. Again, last week, there was a police attack, and a 14-year-old kid was murdered by the police. This is also showing that the struggle will continue, and more violently And also you can see that this is not just a matter of the region, because you can see that the late attacks in France to the journalists, that this has to be taken very seriously at the international level, especially for the revolutionaries. And this shows also the importance of Rojava revolution against the ISIS and radical Islamism. I think the international support would be doing more actions locally against the real powers which are supporting the ISIS.
Yeah, definitely. We will talk about this more on other channels. For now, I thank you very much for joining in our show and giving all these informations. Not only today, also thank you for the informations DAF are sharing in other ways, through texts and so on. So we want to give big greetings to DAF and to your activities, and wish you all the best. And we stay in touch, obviously. We must stay in touch and continue this discussion and practice.
Yeah, long live the revolution of Rojava and long live Anarchist Revolution. Greetings to you all.
Long live.
Yeah. Solidarity.
Solidarity.
Ciao.
Ciao.
We'll continue our coverage of the struggle against ISIS in Kobane and the Rojava Revolution with this interview with another member of the Turkish DAF, conducted by CrimethInc operatives between October and December 2014. In it, they elaborate on the regional and global geopolitical context in which the struggle takes place and prospects for the future. You can read a version of this discussion on the CrimethInc blog, while a revised edition will be released in the forthcoming issue of Rolling Thunder magazine. How is the struggle in Kobane changing the political context in Turkey, both for President Erdogan and for social movements for liberation?
The Turkish state has had to take steps backward in relation to the resistance in Kobane. It has stopped openly supporting ISIS, although it is still supporting ISIS behind the scenes. It had plans to occupy in the name of creating a security region, which included military intervention to weaken the Kurdish struggle and also attacking Assad's forces, in alliance with the Muslim Brotherhood of Syria. These plans have failed. The solidarity actions carried out by social movements for liberation spread around the world to an extent that was unseen in recent years. This international solidarity was an important factor in the success of the Kobane resistance. Rojava is another example proving that people can make a revolution without a vanguard party or a group of the elite, even where there is no industry. And this can happen in a place like the Middle East, where struggling for freedom means fighting against all kinds of oppression, including patriarchy as well as massacres based on ethnicity and religion.
Speaking of revolution without a vanguard party, can you say anything on the relationship between armed struggle and vanguardism? Does armed warfare inevitably compromise anti-authoritarian struggles? Or are there ways to engage in warfare that do not inevitably produce hierarchies and specialization?
When all the people who are able are armed, who is the vanguard? The People's Self-Defense Forces in Rojava include all ages, both men and women, who are already legendary fighters, from all ethnic and religious backgrounds in the region. The hierarchy created in the armed struggle of the guerrilla does not necessarily mean an exclusive authority in the social structures created by the revolution. This awareness is a part of the Rojava people's struggle for freedom.
DAF texts have described the Islamic State as the violent mob produced by global capitalism and the subcontractor of the states that pursue income strategies on the region. Can you explain precisely what your analysis of the Islamic State is, why it appeared, and whose interests it serves?
It is obvious that the actions of the Islamic State benefit the powers, economic and political, that have goals in the region. These could be direct or indirect benefits that strengthen the hand of these powers. For example, a radical Islamist group is useful for Western economic or political powers to make propaganda about defending Western values. Islamic terror is one of the biggest issues that Western countries make propaganda about. Moreover, it is also a political reality that some countries, including the U.S., have agreements with these fundamentalists. This is the 50-year running Middle East policy of Western countries. The Turkish state expressed a negative view of the Islamic State in every speech of its bureaucrats. But we have witnessed real political cooperation of the Turkish state with the Islamic State in relation to the resistance in Kobane. So in this situation, although they are claiming that they are not supporting ISIS, the Turkish state has been providing large amounts of arms, supplies, and recruits to them ever since the time when it was part of the globally supported Free Syrian Army. This support continues surreptitiously, since politically, the Turkish state had to seem to be against ISIS after the resistance in Kobane succeeded. Our comrades at the Turkish border with Syria are still reporting suspiciously large transports crossing it. The Turkish state has strong relations with the Muslim Brotherhood, and their joint long-term goal is to gain more power in the region by eliminating Assad's authority. ISIS is their ally in this respect also.
Arguably, the Islamic State could never have come to power without the weapons and instability that the United States imported to Iraq. At the same time, it appears that U.S. airstrikes in coordination with fighters in Kobane have played a significant role in preventing the Islamic State from gaining control of the city. Has this enabled the United States to legitimize itself among those defending Rojava? What challenges does this create there for anarchists who oppose state power?
This false impression is a product of the mainstream media. U.S. airstrikes began very late, after it was evident that Kobane would not fall, and they were not critical. The bombings also hit the areas in YPG control by mistake, and some ammunition landed in the hands of ISIS also by mistake. The success of the Kobane resistance can only be attributed to the self-organized power of the People's Armed Forces. Because of this strong resistance, as well as extensive international solidarity, the U.S. and its allies had to take steps backwards. The bombings and media coverage are part of the political maneuvers against the revolution that will try to destroy it by including it. However, the Rojava revolution is part of a long history of Kurdish people's struggle for freedom. Its insistence on being stateless, its gains in the liberation of women, etc., are not coincidences. The challenge is to communicate the values created in the Rojava revolution and the political reality of wartime conditions.
Some anarchists in the U.S. have spoken of certain ethnic groups, such as the Mayan people of Chiapas, as if they are culturally anarchist. Now, some people here are speaking about the Kurdish people in the same way. To us, although we don't want to render the struggles of oppressed and colonized peoples invisible, it also seems simplistic and dangerous to confuse ethnic identity with politics. Likewise, our comrades in former Yugoslavia have expressed concerns over struggles that are based in ethnic or religious identity on account of their experience in the civil war of the 1990s. How important is ethnic identity in the struggle in Rojava? Do you see this as a potential problem or not?
The Rojava revolution is made by peoples with at least 4 different ethnic and 3 different religious backgrounds who are actively taking part equally on both military and social fronts. Also, the people of Rojava insist on being stateless when there is already a neighboring Kurdish state in place. Kurdish ethnic identity has been subject to the denial and oppression policies of all the states in the region. Raising oppressed identities is strategically important in people's struggle for freedom, but not to the extent that it is a device of discrimination and deception. This balance is of key importance, and the Rojava revolution has already proved itself in this respect. DAF also finds that the values that the people of Chiapas have created in their struggle for freedom align with anarchism, although culturally anarchist would not be a term we would use.
Are there any other regions of the Middle East where social experiments like the one in Rojava are taking place, or where they might emerge? What would it take internationally for what is promising in Rojava to spread?
The Rojava revolution has been developing in a time when many socio-economic crises appeared around the world: Greece, Egypt, Ukraine. During the first period of the Arab Spring, the social opposition supported this spring wave. After a while, these waves evolved into clashes between fundamentalist and secular militarist powers. So the revolution in Rojava appeared at a conjuncture when the social opposition had lost their hopes in the Middle East. Its own international character and international solidarity will spread this effort. first in the Middle East, then around the world.
One crucial part of the transformation taking place in Rojava today is a revolution against patriarchy and the oppression of women. The official ideology of the PKK and its affiliated organizations includes total gender equality as a central tenet. Here's an excerpt from a talk given by American anarchist and anthropologist David Graeber, discussing his experience on a delegation visiting Rojava a few months ago. He discusses how the struggle against patriarchy fits within the revolutionary new forms of social organization being instituted in the autonomous territories.
I just came back from a trip to Rojava in northern Syria. You know, the first place we went was a police academy. It was like a place that, like, the Syrian regime used to use to torture people, had now been converted to a police academy. But their idea of a police academy was a place where they have 6-month trainings, and you have to take courses on feminist theory before you're allowed to touch a weapon, for example. They said there, well, you know, this is a police academy, and our basic idea is we want to give everybody in the entire country 6 weeks of police training, and then we can abolish the police. He said, everybody knows how to do it, and you don't need specialists. So everybody could just be part of their local peace and consensus committee, as they call the local justice things. They set up directly democratic assemblies on all these different levels, and every assembly had, it had to have 50-50 gender parity, but at the same time it was matched by an all-women's council that had veto power, and this existed on every level, like from the neighborhood up through the districts to the cities. And the most interesting thing, though, was that they had created a dual power system, and I've never heard of this happening anywhere in history. These guys had gone off and created a dual power situation where they'd created both sides. So essentially they created a bottom-up system of of directly democratic groups which were armed and actually in control. They're the ones who could talk to the security forces and access them. And then that they were ultimately answerable to. And then they created a government with ministries and a parliament which basically had no power for foreign consumption. So they created a dummy government. It looks just like a government, except it lacks any access to mechanisms of coercive power. They can't shoot anybody like the army, and the army elects their officers. It's also bottom up. The army and the police are not answerable to it, but rather to like a bottom up structure. But what everybody who talked about is like, yeah, this is amazing. We're just totally reconstituting society. We've got a plan. And he said we're anti-capitalist, and we decided that if you want to get rid of capitalism, you can't do it without getting rid of the state. But if you want to get rid of the state, you can't do that without getting rid of patriarchy. So we're going to do that.
In practice, this takes shape through a variety of structural safeguards to women's autonomy and protections against male domination. For example, nearly all municipalities have 2 co-mayors, one male and one female, and representative assemblies on all levels are required to include nearly equal proportions of men and women. The all-female YPJ militias exist to counterbalance the traditional predominance of men as armed fighters. An all-female security force responds to conflicts involving women, children, domestic violence, and hate crimes, and also operates all-female safe houses and support hotlines. For some more perspective on the gender politics of the Rojava Revolution, we'll turn next to an excerpt from an interview with Kurdish refugee, activist, and academic Dilar Dirik, speaking live from Kurdistan with Chuck Mertz of the Chicago-based radio show This Is Hell. We strongly encourage you to check out the entire interview, which discusses the historical background to the current revolution, the Turkish state's complicity with ISIS, analysis of the politics of the PKK's listing as a terrorist organization by certain states, including the U.S., and lots more. But in this excerpt, Dirik critiques Western media portrayals of Kurdish women fighters, highlighting their political aspirations outside of the state-based framework of women's rights. You can find the link to the full interview on our website. You can read writings by Dilar Dirik on the Revolutionary Women of Rojava on her blog at dilar91.blogspot.ch. Also, many thanks to the folks at Antidote Magazine for sending the interview our way. You can read their transcript as well as a lot of terrific coverage of the events in Rojava at antidotezine.com.
So at the Roj Women's Association's website where you blog, that's rojwomen.org, there's a story posted from the November 10th International Business Times headlined, Syria ISIS Crisis. Kurds grant women equal rights in defense of ISIS laws. New decree also abolishes forced marriage and honor killing. The story reports the local government of an autonomous Kurdish area in Syria has granted women equal rights to men. What do you mean by equal rights to men? Because this sounds great. There isn't equal rights to men between men and women anywhere in the world.
First of all, this news item is actually quite old and it's very inadequate. And there was a columnist on CNN who wrote something very problematic, also meaning to sound very nice or something. I don't know what her intention was, but basically what she said is the Kurdish women who are fighting against ISIS are in fact trying to send us, the West, a message that they share our values. No, they simply don't. They have much, much better things to do than to worry about what white women in America think about them. You know, first of all, the people in Rojava actively oppose capitalism as an economic system. They oppose the premises on which the international order is built, such as the state, such as patriarchy, and so on. And they do not believe that women are more liberated in the West. So giving them rights is actually also nothing that happened recently. Ever since the beginning, since 2012, in the foundations of these three cantons as well, they have gotten rid of polygamy, of child marriage, of they criminalized honor killings, and so on. So this equal rights thing was there before, but the important emphasis is that the women's movement in Rojava does not think in terms of rights, because there is no state to give you rights. They have learned it the hard way that rights simply don't exist. You have to struggle in order to create a society in which social justice and equality are internalized, because who cares about rights that exist on paper and don't mean anything in reality? Because this is a very feudal, patriarchal society, and only with a real, meaningful struggle the mentality of the society can change. So terming it in terms of, oh, look, there's equal rights here, and on the other hand, ISIS is enslaving women, this is also very simplistic. And this is not what this revolution is about. This revolution is also criticizing the West. It's also criticizing this chauvinism with which many people are approaching what's happening there. And this is actually something that's quite common, I think, in advanced capitalist countries, even among the leftists who look down on revolutions or, changes in the global South. And I think this is very problematic. And even though many of these people are trying to be in solidarity with the people there, they actually don't do them a favor by pitting different communities against each other and make it about secularism versus religion or civilization versus barbarism.
One of the things I wanted to mention real quick, because we were mentioning stereotypes that the West has of the Middle East, of Arab people, of Muslim people, all the stereotypes that we have. And you write about how much the glamorization of the Kurdish woman fighter is distracting the media from the message that the Kurdish women, from the politics of the Kurdish women fighters. Yeah. But I think that this is all based on, obviously, I think stereotypes and sexism and racism towards people in the Middle East, because we believe in the West that it is the most patriarchal society in the Middle East, and that the women are, for whatever reason, even if it's just the wearing of the veil, that somehow that they are subjugated or subordinated, or somehow that they like that position. They don't mind being subordinated or subjugated. But in fact, that is not the case whatsoever. Why is it not unique to you that Kurdish women are leading the fight against the Islamic State?
First of all, we do have to keep in mind that this is a very patriarchal region. That is true. But there's many different reasons for that. But that is true that in this region, women have it really bad. It's always important to keep that in mind. But, I'm a 90s child, and I grew up seeing Kurdish guerrilla fighters who are women. And most people in my generation, all Kurdish people in my generation, some slightly older and those who are younger, have grown up with this reality. So actually, if Kurdish women had not been fighting against Islamic State, we would have been surprised, because this has just been established as something quite natural in Kurdish politics. And it doesn't matter if you support these fighters or if you don't. The truth is they are there. And this, of course, shapes your perception of women. If you see women who are armed as fighters fighting against different states, that does a lot with your perception. So it's important to keep in mind that the cause of women in places that are perceived as oppressed or oppressive and so on has often been used by imperialism. We have to go and rescue the women, for example, Afghan women, Iraqi women. This has always been used to portray this region as this very patriarchal and backward place, and the West has to intervene and rescue specifically the women. But many times the voices of these women are not listened to. Many women, you can disagree or agree with it, but many women do not just measure their level of oppressiveness by a veil that they are wearing or not wearing. It's not simple like that. So in order to justify these unjust wars in the Middle East, the women have always been portrayed as these victims that need to be rescued. But what happened? Why don't the U.S. drone strikes, the drones, the airstrikes, the devastation that was caused in these wars, which have disproportionately affected women and killed women and displaced women, that's not oppression or what? Justifying the existing patriarchy in this region, justifying unjust wars by that is just absolutely insane. So, from an Orientalist perspective, seeing women taking up arms against this explicitly feminicidal system of ISIS, of course, challenges, first of all, very stereotypical, prejudiced perceptions of women in the Middle East. But, as I've said in my articles and as we mentioned earlier, this is not something that just came out of nowhere. And it's very disheartening to see that the politics of these women are just taken out of the equation. But the truth is, as we've discussed earlier, the ideology of the PKK plays an explicit role in this. The PKK's ideology is directly responsible for the fighters in Kobani who are women. I was there, not in Kobani, but in another region in Rojava. I spoke to these women fighters, and I spoke about the media's representation as well. And one of them said, one commander said, "We don't want the world to know us as the women fighting ISIS only. And we also don't want people to know us for our weapons. We want them to know us for our ideas. And our ideas are based on the philosophy of Abdullah Öcalan, who is the ideological representative of the PKK. So this is something a commander of a brigade that is fighting against ISIS in Rojava has told me and others. And you see Öcalan's pictures everywhere. So, yeah, you may or may not like the PKK or Öcalan, but that does not matter. What matters is the fact that these people are fighting with this philosophy. And when Kobani was liberated, they immediately chanted slogans praising Öcalan, for example. Okay, you can criticize many things, but at least acknowledge that this is these people's loyalties. You don't have to like it. You can criticize this ideology, but this is what it is. This ideology lies behind this resistance against the Islamic State. But nobody wants to know that because the PKK is listed as a terrorist organization. It's first of all important to keep in mind that it's incredibly brave that these women are fighting against an ideology that is explicitly enslaving women as sex slaves, raping them, selling them, killing them, and so on. So these are two quite contrary worldviews, if we say. But on the other hand, why not support the politics of Rojava, the system that is being created there, that is explicitly centered around women's liberation? Gender equality is being taught to the soldiers, to the internal security officers, to the teachers, to the health officers, and so on. So there is a new kind of alternative society that is being created there. But that's also something that people don't want to see. Even leftists, even anarchists and so on, people who should be in solidarity with what is happening in Rojava, keep criticizing for not being, I don't know, ideology X enough, Marxist enough, anarchist enough, feminist enough, whatever. But the truth is these people are creating a new life there. They are establishing a revolution there, and it should be everyone's task to support this and at least give constructive critique rather than just ranting about why they're not fitting into your dogmatic ideologies or whatever.
We have been speaking with Dilar Dirick. She is an activist of the Kurdish women's movement and a PhD candidate in the sociology department of the University of Cambridge, where her research focuses on Kurdistan, the Kurdish women's movement, and the PYD, or Democratic Union Party, which has existed in the Rojava territories since 2004. One last question for you, Dilar. Do you believe that the Islamic State, because of the way it so horribly treats, rapes, enslaves women, do you believe that the Islamic State can actually bolster feminism in the Middle East and around the world?
Yes and no. Well, one terrible thing about this is, like, whenever a whole huge tragedy such as this one happens, is that the threshold of bad stuff that people can handle just changes. So things then start to be measured by the worst, you know. So, for example, the enslavement of all these, specifically the Yazidi women, has just traumatized and done so much damage and suffering to the people in the region. So, one danger of this is that from now on, violence against women would be measured by these standards, like even worse standards. So the worse the standards get, the more tolerance we have to it, and that's a horrible, horrible side effect. But on the other hand, I think not the Islamic State's specific war on women, but rather the resistance which women have shown, specifically in Kobani, has changed a lot. It changed the terms of being women in the Middle East, I think. I know many people who even contact me just to say how inspired they are and how this has inspired their own struggles. So I think it's not this Islamic State's terribleness, but the resistance, the strength, the pride, really pride, and the real sense of these women with which they confronted the Islamic State and showed that a different world is possible, that women can do this and that women exist, that women are not slaves, that women have the power to change their status and change the patriarchy in the region. I think it's the women's resistance that will change perceptions and issues of violence against women and patriarchy and so on, but only if it's accompanied by a longer endless struggle, because just taking up arms in times of war and conflict is often in danger of just being forgotten afterwards. But if we look at the system in Rojava, we will see that all the policies of the people there, the activeness of the women's movement, and just from speaking to the fighters there, how they tell about the ways their lives have changed, how they are seen as, different now because they're women, because they have taken in part in this resistance. I think this is what will eventually change, not what the Islamic State has done. From what I've seen, from what I've observed, the women who have been fighting against ISIS have really been like a rising sun to many people, and I think this will be a much more powerful counterforce than what the Islamic State has done in terms of damage.
This episode on The Chopping Block, we're excited to review a new book release that documents and analyzes the unfolding revolution in Rojava. It's titled, A Small Key Can Open a Large Door, The Rojava Revolution. The book comes to us from Strangers in a Tangled Wilderness, an imprint of Combustion Books, which describes itself as a collectively run publisher of dangerous fiction, focusing on genre stories that confront, subvert, or rudely ignore the dominant paradigm. This time, though, they've given us a brilliant and timely encapsulation of a contemporary political crisis in this elegantly designed collection. In just under 200 pages, this pocket-sized volume assembles some 15 different short texts describing different aspects of the Rojava Revolution and their struggle against ISIS in Kobane, along with an introduction providing background and several appendices. The text includes statements from Kurdish groups inside and outside of the region, voices of international solidarity, interviews with travelers, and others with direct experience of the situation. They discuss gender and the women's movement, the political and economic philosophies underlying the social struggle, the war against ISIS in the complex international context, the crucial importance of international solidarity, and a variety of other themes. Several I had read before online, while many were new to me, having been culled from a variety of divergent sources. Each essay or excerpt begins with a short statement from the editors describing its source and some context, so we're never left totally in the dark as to how to approach the material we're reading. Perhaps the most heartrending and inspiring piece in the collection is a letter written by a 19-year-old fighter from a women's protection unit militia in Kobane during the siege, describing to her mother what she has seen and what she hopes for herself, her comrades, and her struggle. One of the major assets of the collection is the thorough but concise introduction, which lays out a helpful history of Kurdish struggles in the region, including how each of the bordering states and other global powers have alternately repressed or attempted to selectively support and appropriate Kurdish resistance. From within this historical and geopolitical context, it traces the evolution of the PKK from dogmatic guerrilla Marx-Lenin-Maoism to a more anti-authoritarian model. After explaining the core concepts of democratic confederalism, women's liberation, radical pluralism, and the people's economy, along with examples of how they are playing out in practice, it concludes with a ringing appeal for anarchist solidarity with the revolution in Rojava. The introduction proved to be 40 of the most helpful pages I've read this year toward understanding current events in the Middle East. The only drawback is the total lack of citations for its sources, which leaves us wondering where the information came from and how to evaluate it. Nonetheless, in tandem with the short essays that follow and other external reading, it provides an indispensable orientation to a mind-bendingly complex situation. Among its many helpful features are a glossary of terms, people, and acronyms for reference, a timeline of Kurdish resistance from the mid-19th century through today, a map of the autonomous districts and surrounding territories, and the constitution of the Rojava cantons, which outline the principles of social, economic, and political organization in the territories. One of the most encouraging impressions we got from reading A Small Key Can Open a Large Door is that of passionate enthusiasm tempered with realism. Despite their active support for the efforts of the people of Rojava, the editors and contributors don't gloss over the ambiguities and imperfections of the events and projects there. For example, they acknowledge that aspects of how the economic program of the revolutionaries is playing out in practice, or how it will shift as the geopolitical situation develops, remain unclear or vague. Likewise, they engage with the authoritarian legacy of the PKK and the ambiguous alliance of interest between the Rojava fighters and the U.S. military, convincingly arguing for the urgent importance of solidarity while not abandoning a critical perspective. The editors propose that North American anarchists mobilize to support the Rojava struggle, while learning all that we can from it to inspire our struggles at home. As they conclude their introduction, the people of Rojava have chosen to fight, and so must we. That said, there are critiques of this struggle to be made from an anarchist perspective, of course, and they have been made, at length, in various online articles and forums. The book clearly appears as a challenge to critics who would dismiss the struggle in Rojava out of hand, responding to some of the common critiques, while arguing for the necessity of solidarity nonetheless. I empathize with the contempt for armchair theorists who cite other armchair theorists to explain why they needn't leave their armchairs when a social revolution is unfolding. Yet, uncritical solidarity with anything that describes itself as anarchist or anti-authoritarian has not led us in wholesome directions, if history offers any lessons. If you approach this book as a skeptic dismissive of the revolutionary potential of events in Rojava, it may help cut through some of your skepticism and motivate more engagement. Of course, it may not, but at minimum it will leave you better informed for whatever engagement you undertake. If you approach it knowing little or already sympathetic, you're likely to put it down fired up and eager to do what you can to show solidarity. The editors, and certainly we at the Ex-Worker, hope you get and stay fired up and translate your excitement into action. But also seek out some of the more thoughtful critiques, if you can filter them out of the sludge of trolls and navel-gazers, and let that temper your enthusiasm. Not in the sense of dampening it, but in the sense of tempering steel, making it harder and sharper and increasing its efficacy. Let's always remember that both education and information, as well as criticism and critique, exist first and foremost to catalyze action, not to inhibit it. All that said, we can't recommend this little book highly enough for an accessible, wide-ranging, and essential introduction to the social and political experiments unfolding in Rojava. To read more or order copies, check out tangledwilderness.org or combustionbooks.org.
So that just about wraps it up for this episode. There are plenty of interesting events and actions on the horizon in the coming weeks, but we'll just mention a couple right now. May 13th marks the 30th anniversary of the bombing of the Move House in West Philadelphia. As we discussed in episode 34, the struggle of the Move organization against racial and ecological oppression continues, despite the incarceration of many of the Move family for decades. On May 13th, a massive demonstration and march has been called in Philadelphia to demand their freedom and to commemorate the bombing, with speakers from Ward Churchill to Alice Walker contributing their support. If you can make it, please come out. You can find out more at onamove.com. On May 16th, the Orange County Anarchist Book Fair will take place in Santa Ana, California. From May 19th through 22nd, Polish activists are organizing an anti-border convergence in Warsaw. They write, on May 21st, 2015, the creme de la creme of European racism will gather in Warsaw, Poland to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the creation of one of the most influential meta-organizations that guards assets of the Fortress Europe. This organization, Frontex, is a hybrid of border police and intelligence service, as well as aggressive promoter of anti-migrant policy. When migrant circles in Europe come together in resistance and repression is on the rise, we cannot remain passive. Unite against institutional state fascism in the name of a real and practical transnational solidarity. And as a part of the ongoing month-long Festival of Anarchy those maniacs have up there, the Montreal Anarchist Book Fair will take place May 23rd and 24th, as well as an art and anarchy exhibition and an anarchist film festival, plus the International Anarchist Theater Festival on the 19th and 20th, and something called the Glamarchist Look Fair, which I guess is a queer dance party? God, Montreal, why are you so cool? Anyway, let's finally wrap things up with some prisoner birthdays. On May 12th, Alvaro Luna Hernandez, an anti-racist organizer serving 50 years for thwarting an attempt on his life by a police officer. And on May 21st, Mondo Wilonga, a former Black Panther and author targeted by COINTELPRO in Nebraska. As usual, info about their cases and their current mailing addresses can be found on our website, crimethink.com/podcast.
And that's all for this episode of The Ex-Worker. Thanks to the comrades from Turkey and Rojava who contributed their words and voices, and to our friends at Cherna Luknia for sharing the audio. And thanks to all of you patient listeners for tuning back in. Next time, we're going to be releasing a special episode, an audio documentary on the Hambacher forest occupation in Western Germany. After that, we'll resume our usual episodes of news, reviews, analysis, and all the rest. Till next time.
Long live the revolution of Rojava and long live anarchist revolution. Greetings to you all.
They asked for calm, and there is no calm tonight.
No, I mean, there shouldn't be calm tonight. Black people are dying in the streets. We've been dying in the streets for months, years, decades, centuries. We can't ignore the fact that the city's burning, but we need to be talking about why it's burning and not romanticize peace and not romanticize marching as the only way to function. I'm not saying we should be hurting people. I'm not saying we should be killing people, but we do have to understand that resistance looks different ways to different people, and part of what it means to say Black Lives Matter is to assert our right to have rage, and righteous indignation in the face of state violence. And I think we should be strategic in how we riot.